Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on COVID-19 and the textiles and clothing sector in India. Now I'll hand it over to Mr. Pradeep Mehta to start with the introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. The day being May Day, in 1886, there was a riot in Chicago. Trade union workers or labor had to strike against something, and there was a commotion, there was firing, there were deaths, etc., etc. And since sometime after that, the international community decided to observe May Day as the International Workers' Day or International Workers' Rights Day. It also happens to be the spring day, and it is also a day of celebration in many others who follow me, is the discovery at the ground level as to what is the real situation in terms of decent jobs or good wages and so on. What we have found so far is the situation is not rosy, it's not hunky-dory, pretty bad. And in fact, I and Arun also wrote about it in an article. And before that, I also, 3 articles I wrote along with Abhishek, who used to be the project manager in the past. Now he's gone off to greener pastures. And he's here also with this meeting. I would like to welcome Abhishek also for the excellent groundwork that he had done to facilitate the project. So we are in good hands. And what we will hear in times to in today's webinar is as to what the outcome of this particular study was, this particular segment of the study, which is on textile and clothing, and some bit about what other sectors that we're going to do, including seek the views of the House as to how we should go ahead with that. Now, let me hand over to Vipul Chatterjee to make a presentation on the report that has been sent to most of you of the textile and clothing sector in this particular project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pradeep, and let me join you and other colleagues in welcoming the participants, panelists, and the participants of this webinar. It's my pleasure to make a presentation. I'm going to take about 8 to 10 minutes in doing so, which is based on an extensive field work which we have done as part of this project. This project is supported by the Ford Foundation, so let me also thank Ford Foundation at the outset for supporting us in this project. So Trinani, presentation please on the screen. So as Pradeep has already introduced, this is the project which we are calling Good and Better Jobs in India. Let me at the outset say 2 things which are very general. I mean, here we are not talking about job creation. We are talking about the existing jobs in this particular sector and what are the quality of jobs that we are seeing or we have seen in this particular sector. Next slide, please. This is a very brief outline of our presentation. Of course, I'm not going to put equal time on each of them. Particularly, I'm going to put some time on the key findings and recommendations, including possible impact of COVID-19, which we have done a brief case study of Yuandi on this sector. Next slide, please. This is the snapshot of our fieldwork, which we have done in places all over the country. These are some very broad data, important data of this sector. I mean, this is, as you know, that this is perhaps after agriculture the second most important sectors in India, which is providing direct and taking direct and indirect employment. It's more than 10 crore, and our global ranking is second largest manufacturer and exporter of textiles and clothing products we have having about 5% share in global TNC trade. Next, please. So we looked at the instead of looking at the sector in siloed manner, and based on our interaction with the project advisors, particularly Mr. Maida, we looked at the sector as clusters, and we looked at the whole value chain of the sectors by doing our field work from spinning to weaving to processing to garmenting in different parts of the country. So these are the places, as I said before, that we have done our field work. Next, please. And since we have looked at this sector more as an ecosystem of this sector as a whole, uh, these are the number of structural issues which we have found, not just from our fieldwork, but also from the literature review which we have done about the conditions of this sector in India. As you can see that other than just labor issues, and this is the ecosystem which we are talking about, we looked at good and better jobs. We addressed this question about good and better jobs, not just from the lens of labor issues, but also a range of other structural issues which we have covered. Next, please. So this is a brief case study which we have done, where we tried to look at what would be the possible impact of COVID-19. And the long and short of the story is that we are seeing these aggravating of these structural issues which this sector is already facing. I mean, this is nothing new, and as we are reading from various reports, both in newspapers and in other sources, that these issues were already there, and now we are seeing much more manifestation of these issues as we are undergoing this lockdown in the country as a result of this virus. Next, please. So these are the key findings, and I'd like to spend some time on this. I mean, we found that unless we reduce the cost of production, we found that in every respect except the labor cost, the cost of production in this sector is very high. Perhaps it cuts across many other sectors. This is, in general, this is a bane of the Indian economy, and we have been talking about it. Many of us are talking about it for quite some time. Not just raw materials, but also other cost of production like electricity tariffs, cost of capital, cost of land, cost of logistics. All these costs are very high as compared to our competitors, and in relative terms as well as in absolute. So if we talk about workers' well-being, which essentially means increase in income of workers, along with other factors related to social security, better working facilities and things like that. It's no way, even if I talk to an entrepreneur, maybe she or he may be an altruist.
Yes.
But even then,
Yeah.
it is,
I know I'm on the site.
no,
Can you see me on the screen?
Yes, we can see you. It is next to impossible for that entrepreneur to pay better wages unless she or he can reduce her cost of production. So this is the big story which we have come out with. Next, please. Next. So we did this exercise. We assumed that suppose there is 4% sales growth, along with one scenario where we have the existing wages and other input costs, and we found that even with 4% sales growth in this sector, it's not break-even. The total cost is higher than the total revenue. But if we can reduce the cost, then even after paying higher wages, the total cost is less than the total revenue realization. So the key thing is how we're going to reduce the cost of production. That's the first condition. Then the what kind of compact that we can think about in order for our workers to get better wages. As a result of that reduction in cost of production, that is the key message which we are conveying as part of this work. Next, please. So, as I said before, when we talk about workers' well-being, it's not just wages. We have to look at the entire ecosystem. This is the ecosystem that we are about. Worker well-being is impacted by a number of factors. Financial well-being, there is opportunities for skill development, and of course, working conditions, social security, and collectivism of workers. And each of these factors are interrelated with each other in some way or the other. So you have to take a very holistic approach, and this is what we are trying to emphasize on. It's not just the job of one ministry or one department to look after this subject. We need to take a holistic. That's another key message which we have come out with. Next, please. So now coming to the recommendations, as I said, while doing this field work, the first challenge, I would say challenge, I never use the word problem. The first challenge which you encounter is that there is hardly any data. Whether in the public domain, there is hardly any secondary data. And it's also difficult to collect primary data. So we need to improve our data collection and data, both the process as well as the content of both workers and enterprises. Next. Then there is, we didn't find any linkages between wages and social security. Whatever little that we have, when we looked at this sector, this is a combination of organized and unorganized. So there is very little linkages between wages and social security. And that is something which we need to establish. Third, please. Skill development. Whenever we are talking about social security, we are still talking about the old system of social security, which is just about a little bit of provident fund or a little bit of medical benefits and things like that. Skill development is not part of our social security thinking, I would say, or framework. So that is something which we need to take forward. Skill development should be an intrinsic part of our social security framework. Fourth one, technology. We have found that there are enterprises, units which are using new technologies to address occupational health and safety related issues. Whereas similar units, similar in the sense, similar in size, similar in revenue and things like that, other factors, they are not. So leveraging technology is very, very important to address this very important issue of occupational health and safety, which is largely, I would say, largely missing, except in those units who are somehow large. Not large in international sense, but somehow large in the Indian context. The fifth one, this is something which is not new. Still, when we looked at these clusters, we have gone into many clusters. We found that this is largely on paper. So cluster development of micro, small and medium enterprises. And I would particularly put emphasis on small and medium enterprises and then link them with the micro enterprises for larger cluster development that we should talk about. And the final one, we have to address a number of systemic issues. As we see that when you look at that whole ecosystem, the point which we are emphasizing is that each of them are important. There is hardly any scope for relative importance of them. Each of them are important. So you have to address all those systemic issues in order to see a better ecosystem, not just for good and better jobs, but better ecosystem of the sector, which will then lead to good and better jobs of workers in this sector. Next one. So I think, yeah, that was the financial slide, and I think let me stop here. So in the presentation, we have a couple of more slides where we have described the broad contour of the project and what we are going to do in future. But that is something which we can come later. So over to you, Pradeep. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Vipul. And may I now request for the panel, Ritu join. Has Ritu Parna joined?
She is joining in a minute, sir. I just had a chat with her.
Very good. Now, how we are going to look at, we have 7 speakers instead of 8. Radhika Kapoor had to regret. Now, what we thought was a good, sharp introductory remark of 5 minutes each, and then we go on to Q&A, and then we come back to the panel again. That would make it interesting. Our total session is about 1.5 hours. So may I request Arun to please kick off?
Thank you very
Arun?
much. Thank you very much, Pradeep. And Vipul, thank you very much. I also want to thank and congratulate Ford Foundation for having asked us very deliberately, almost 2 to 3 years ago, to consider looking at reality with a new lens. That we were all noticing when you're looking at the top lines of the economy, that growth was slowing down. And very soon industries were telling us that they didn't find enough demand growing, which was very worrying, especially for even simple consumer goods. And so it was alerting us to the lack of growth of incomes for people in most of India. And so they said, let's look at this problem with a fresh lens and not the usual macroeconomic modeling on what is going on and what may be solutions which will produce a more resilient economy for people in India. So thank you to the Ford Foundation for encouraging cuts and enabling cuts to take a deeper and a longer study and not to just produce a report in a hurry. Of course, as Pradeep has put very well, this May Day has shown up things which the study was already checking into and which the COVID-19 has brought to the fore very clearly. The cracks in the structure of our economy and the fragility in the lives of not just 5 or 10% of Indians, but it could be 40, 50% of the people in this country, the fragility of the incomes that they earn and the way they earn those incomes. I want to make 4 points very briefly. The first is the difference in this study from other studies that we had access to and continue to have access to, which were based on numbers, on data sets and numbers. And as Pradeep and Vipul, you pointed out, there's a huge lag between getting numbers and then deriving conclusions from the numbers from what is actually changing on the ground. And second is when the phenomenon to be studied is so dispersed into so many small units, gathering the data itself is an arduous exercise. So basing conclusions about what is happening in the lives of small enterprises and in the lives of workers in the small enterprises from data of employment and other matters wasn't revealing the reality on the ground. So this study's principle has been, let's look at the real thing and go to the real place and talk to real people and let's understand reality. The second is, I like very much, as you put it, Vipul, about the focus on well-being. Now, well-being is not related directly to size. In fact, if you become very large in size, well-being could probably be reduced, and doctors do advise you to manage the internal harmony of things inside yourself and reduce the overall size. So with the GDP, we've been focused so much on increasing the size of the economy, the GDP, that we were losing sight of the health of the economy, the well-being of organs inside the economy. And amongst those, you focused very well on the well-being of small enterprises and the well-being of people, especially those who work in those small enterprises, which is what the COVID pandemic has shown us has been so fragile. Our condition of our health of the economy has been so fragile with respect to these entities, which are the majority of our economy. They constitute the large part of our economy. So the focus on well-being and the multifaceted forces that influence and create well-being, thank you for emphasizing the systems thinking that we must now apply if we want to improve the health of a complex system. The third point rather, is the point you made very well about workers, Bipul, that the cost of workers, even in small enterprises, where the cost of labor is inherently large, and that is why they're great employers of people, they have less access to capital, finance, and other resources. And so they do use more labor in their production. And thank goodness they do, as I say, otherwise where would the people go to work? But even in their case, the cost of wages is not a very large cost overall in their economics. What has to be reduced, as you're pointing out, is other costs that are used by these enterprises and the way they use them, as well as that are provided to them. And in that, to consider workers as a means for improving the productivity of all resources in the enterprise, the improvement of skills of the workers, yes, to improve their vocational skills to do the task that they are supposed to, but also their skills to relate to systems inside the enterprises and improve them. Did you say something, Pradeep?
No, it's all right. Just request you to wind up as ASAP.
Yes, please. And the winding up is about voices. Let's not at this moment still the voices of those people whose voices we've not heard. I think that's what has come out to me most clearly, that we weren't listening to the voices of the people that matter, these voices of the workers and of the small enterprises. In formulating policies also, and I've had some experience there, we hear, as I said earlier, the numbers which are derived from voices, they don't always represent accurately the reality. We hear the bigger voices, they have a larger seat at the table. Hearing the voices accurately to understand what needs to be reformed and what will be the right reforms is key, one. Number two, we must continuously hear these voices, have channels, whether through representation, better clusters, better associations of the workers, clusters of the enterprise association of workers, so that the system remains healthy. There's no point in not hearing what is going on and then finding the system in crisis and then trying to get fancy doctors, big doctors, to figure out the strong medicine required for the system. So those are my insights from what you have put out. And so thank you very much for giving me the extra minute, Pradeep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun. Just to tell the audience here that Arun is the chairman of our project advisory committee as well, and has anyway very deep knowledge about these issues. May I request Amit Kapoor, 5 to 7 minutes.
Tough job following up from what Mr. Mehra had actually said. But quickly, a few points that I wanted to share in terms of how I look at the textile industry. And this is bearing on some of the work that we have recently done for the government. So if you really look at the exports, I'm just trying to understand the numbers here. Indian exports have just got pegged to 17 billion, and whereas Bangladesh is close to about 38 billion and Vietnam being close to 27 billion. So that means there is a severe issue in terms of how India is looking at the sector. And when you talk about the costs, there are going to be some severe issues on the cost itself. But the bigger problem is not the labor cost in India. I think it's become a very interesting beating thing across the board, wherein we end up saying that labor cost is high and so on and so forth. In fact, quite interestingly, labor cost in India in comparison to China is close to about one third, if not 1/4. That's where it is. It is much closer to Vietnam cost. Of course, Bangladesh has a lower cost here. But there are two costs which actually drive major sets of issues as I look at it. One is, of course, power, that is electricity. The second one being the cost of finance. So cost of finance is the highest in the country today. It is close to about 13% to 14%. And if it is an MSME sector, it is much higher. So there is that structural issue of how finance has to be got in for this sector. And when I was looking at this, like there is, and if you look at the subsectors, I was just trying to look at the subsectors for this interaction as well. What is alarming is that the sectors which were doing well initially, say something like silk. Silk was the one of the finest sectors in terms of exports or whatever, but it has seen a fall of close to about 15% over the last 4 to 5 years. This is just stunning fall of grace in terms of like how it is. And overall, the sector has actually seen a shrinking of about 0.2% in the last 5 years itself. From if you look at the cumulative CAGR over the last 5 years. Having said that, I think the potential is fairly huge if I get my things right. And there are 2 or 3 things of course, we need to get right. But if we get it right, today, the size of the industry, if you say the market size of India is about $100 billion, if we really continue to grow at the global growth levels of 5%, we will talk about the sector size of 220 billion in 2035. But if we grow at 10%, we can talk about 460. But how do we grow at that 10% is going to be a critical issue. So to grow at that point, we will have to look at exports as the driver itself. And we always talk about the internal consumption story and things, but we have to talk about exports. But if we have to get exports right, we have to do away with some of the issues that the complete ecosystem has. Like one of the issues that I was able to understand was that we have hugely high custom and anti-dumping duties. Like India has to import a lot of fabric. So on the value chain, fabric is the issue that we are actually talking about. In fact, the biggest issue across the value chain is weaving and fabric processing are the links which just do not work in the right earnest in the country. So if you really have to set it right, we will have to talk about cost of finance. One of the things that has to be taken care of. If we talk about clusters and if we talk about MSME sectors, the support to MSME has to be fairly high. As Mr. Mehra had actually said, the policy, what we see today, effectively becomes a reflection of the large player. In fact, and that is not true only for textile sector, it is true for sectors across the board, wherein we see the large players actually ruling the road. So there seems to be a regulatory capture of sorts that we need to actually break out. The second thing is very clearly that we have to look, when you talk about cluster development, the focus will have to be improving the technological capability. Today, there is also one more thing that we see from technology point of view. If you look at the new man-made fabrics that are coming in and look at the scaling part of it, the scaling is actually the missing element. At the end of the day, if we want to be more competitive, we'll have to be more productive. How can we be more productive? It has to be scaling. How do we scale? It will have to be technology and so on and so forth. Not saying that you have to remove people. People will be the enabling set of people factor here. So that is what will need to be done. And having said that, I think that we might actually see a huge opportunity arising out of COVID. Like COVID, of course, is a shock into the system. It does expose a lot of structural issues that the country has or the economy has. But we will have to see that how this whole trend of, say, if I might say, deglobalization, is that happening? Is that true? Will it drive self-sufficiency? Will it drive a situation wherein the realignment of the global value chain is actually going to happen? But within the apparel sector, I see that the only country against which we can actually gain something is going to be China, not Bangladesh or Vietnam, because they're fairly well embedded into the system, do their processes right. So the only opportunity post-COVID is going to be if you're able to get some share of business from China. And China is how do we get it from China is going to be a critical question. But then again, China is all about scale. So the scale element is missing. So how do we set those things right to really move forward? So these are the broad points which I thought should be talked about. But then, of course, it is all about land, labor, capital, as you would actually say, as factors of production in getting those right. Reduce your skill your labor, reduce cost of finance, enable MSMEs, create these right ecosystem, create the right policy environment, which seems to actually be skewed towards the large players. And then, of course, we have the necessary demand conditions. We might see some slump, at least in the coming 4 to 5 years, because of the absolute recession that the world is going to face. possibly the worst after the Great Depression. So those are a few things we will have to be mindful of. So my initial remarks, Pradeepji, on this.
Thank you very much, Amit. May I now request Sabina?
Sure, thank you, Pradeep. I'll turn my video on now. I like to keep it off when other people are talking just to enable better bandwidth. But thank you so much, Pradeep and Bipul and colleagues at CUTS for inviting me. It's been wonderful being on the project advisory committee for this project. And you know, in times of COVID, it's also nice to see a lot of familiar faces. So hi, Hamed, Arunji, everybody. It's nice to see everybody. So I really just want to actually pick up exactly where Amit left off, which is this notion that, you know, I find that in Just Jobs does a lot of comparative work looking at the textile sector and textile value chains, textile and apparel value chains across different countries. And one of the factors that I find to be quite unique to South Asia relative to those in other countries is this idea, and the report raises this, is this idea that business competitiveness is somehow is exclusive from a well-paid, healthy, and productive workforce, that the two are actually somehow trade-offs and that they are mutually exclusive. And in India, we find that, you know, small businesses in particular have a proclivity toward, or businesses in general have a proclivity toward precariousness, which I don't seem to find, or we don't seem to find in our studies of other countries. For example, Vietnam. I think Amit just raised the example of Vietnam, which I think is a very apt example. So, you know, we find in India that this proclivity toward precariousness, or others call it flexibility, I call it precariousness. We know that 69% of India's firms are unregistered. We know that 99% remain small and are unorganized. We know from our own field research, we did a project with the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation where we know that small businesses, in particular manufacturing businesses, in fact, we look specifically at the apparel sector, prefer to actually hire migrant workers over local workers and workers on a contractual basis for fear of unionization and the fact that, you know, they can actually keep wages lower for migrant workers and keep them sometimes in the factory. Also don't have to deal with things like workers asking for leave because they're away from their families. And so this entire sort of ecosystem that is very much built on firms that are precarious, firms that are small, that are unorganized, that have very high labor turnover. And these are similar characteristics in the sense that we have seen these phenomena in other countries, but the way of dealing with them is completely different. So let me use the example of Vietnam. Just Jobs just finished a 3-year study funded by IDRC looking at Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar, and looking at the apparel and electronics sectors. And we find that in Vietnam, the very same set of factors actually lead businesses to improve labor conditions, to enhance productivity as a means of sort of economic upgrading. As opposed to in India, where the trend is to actually depress labor conditions and keep things small. And so this, to me, begs a larger question about, you know, going much beyond sort of just production costs. So, you know, in your study, you aptly talk about sort of the way that you put it is that, you know, why don't we improve wages by reducing the cost of raw materials and power and maintaining other forms of subsidies, which is all well and good, but I think the overall conversation needs to be much broader than that in terms of how do we reinvigorate manufacturing and labor-intensive apparel industries within that broader ecosystem and actually really address the hindrances to economic upgrading, but more importantly, go much deeper into what is it that prevents businesses, and particularly small and medium businesses, from taking that economic upgrading and translating it into social life, better protection for workers, better wages, more time off, pensions, and so on. And I think here it's a matter of both having policy space and a dialogue on very specifically what are the specific regulations or policies that either hold small businesses back. And I want to be very clear, labor regulations, in my view, and I know Professor Nagaraj is on this call as well, labor regulations are not the major factor that hold businesses back from growing, but there are other factors, and we need to identify what those other regulatory factors are. Is it, ease of registration? Is it taxation policy? Is it, as Amit just mentioned, trade and exports? So what is the ecosystem of factors that prevents businesses from growing and upgrading economically? And then how do you take that and ensure that it translates into social upgrading? The last point I'll make on this is just this idea of the need for a broader guiding framework that looks at a whole basket and range of policies. We do not have an industrial policy. We still are caught in this very neoliberal framing of, growth first and, jobs later. And I think both of those frameworks now need to be kind of turned upside down. People have been talking about it, but in a post-COVID world, we actually have a real opportunity to think through how do you actually build the resilience of people and have social security systems in place that make for consumption smoothing during times of crisis, that actually make for more resilient economies during times of crisis. And how do we claw our way out of this deep hole that we're in, where many small businesses are folding and many more are going to fold? How do we kind of claw ourselves out of this system by having a very clear industrial policy that is focused on labor-intensive manufacturing in sectors like apparel, and then bridging the economic upgrading piece with the social upgrading? So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. Thank you very much. Very interesting remarks, all of you. May I now request Ritu Parna, if she's there? Ritu Parna?
Yeah.
There you are, Ritu Parna. Over to you, about 5 to 7 minutes, Ritu Parna.
It's fascinating because I'm quite overwhelmed seeing the kind of experts that you have lined up. And I think I should give a disclaimer, like I had told Vipul, that I'm no expert in the apparel and textile sector. So I don't know whether from that perspective I'll be able to throw any light, but whatever I've picked up in the initial narration and whatever I've picked up from Mr. Myra, I think, let me put it at this point of time, I represent an organization called TeamLease, and I think we are right at the center of all that's going on around us in terms of jobs or the potential loss of jobs and the paraphernalia, whether it comes to migrant labor, you name it. So I guess if it's appropriate, I can throw some perspective on those aspects of how do I see the future here on, and what is our sense of what's going to happen, given that we are talking about textiles, apparels. I think it goes without saying that that's a sector which comes into the bracket of currently surviving or rather doing pre-COVID, used to be very much dependent on the discretionary spend that used to happen in that sector. But now that we are witnessing COVID, now that the fact that people are preferring to stay within the realms of homes, I think that sector from a discretionary spends perspective is likely to get a huge hit. So I think apparels is a segment which is likely to see a comeback in terms of big revenues over the next 12 months. And the organizations that we work with are already factoring in that reality that very unlikely too many people are going to spend money on, yeah, the basics necessities. And hence it puts more pressure on the textile and the apparel industry from an India perspective. The fact that in the long run, there could be an opportunity emerging for India, undeniable. However, I think if I were to look at the next 12 months, I think the 12 months are going to be very tricky, largely because the future at the moment seems very, very unknowable and unmodelable for most businesses. And it's becoming difficult for organizations to plan how they need to plan their production, their output, how they need to understand or assess the consumer demand. I think if one were to look at it, this is a sector which is in the days to come is looking at quite a distressful scenario until unless the overall consumption levels improve or change. But I think how we handle the phase between now and the next 12 months would be critical. I agree that there is a possibility for us, given the global mood, to actually be able to get some business away from China and bring it to India, and especially in textiles and apparels, and especially if we were to looking at doing it at scale. Unfortunately, the textile apparel story in India has never been a scale story. It has always been a specialized skill set, whether it's in terms of the availability of skills, formally trained skills. It has always been rather limited. While there has been some push from the textile sector skill councils to kind of enable those skills, I think where I see we will be falling short is clearly on availability of skills, even if we are able to manage to veer some of the opportunities which were earlier with China to India. So honestly, again, I am no, I will keep repeating myself. I am no expert on textile and apparel. I am talking from the perspective of somebody which enables that sector with manpower. And most of those manpower are formal manpower, which are in the retail outlets and stores of these apparel units. And if I were to look at them, I think we're looking at very difficult times for the next 12 months. I won't take much of your time. I don't think I should come in between the other experts who can throw more light on textile and apparels. But if you think I can add value to taking any questions or queries around how we are looking at the future here on, which of course is unmodelable, but still, if there is some hypothesis with which we are progressing, I'm happy to respond to that.
Thank you, Rituparna. That was, in fact, if you ask me, I see the next 12 to 24 months as being very uncertain, because things have become so topsy-turvy.
Yes.
How they're going to evolve, one doesn't know. With that, can I'll change the order and invite Mr. Gupta, who's here from Raymond's, the only industry representative here. Mr. Gupta, over to you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, instead of dwelling on the macro aspects, I would like to straight away address the issue very nicely articulated by COVID, and we must thank you, the organization. Though in textile industry, we are quite familiar with this lower wages being paid by informal sector, lack of social security, safety, etc. And mind, it's not only confined to the SMEs. There are large organization textiles, especially in Gujarat and part of Maharashtra, who have been also, not paying full wages or asking workers to work for 12 hours and pay 8 hours. It's quite prevalent in larger sector as well. So the challenge is, how do we implement this on the ground, and the political will, government will, to see that this problem is resolved. Now, I in my personal capacity would like to offer some suggestions which are not in any way reflecting my company's views. These are my personal views. I would say that the entire problem can be addressed in three ways. First is, government should resolve the issue is they must effectively enforce Minimum Wages Act and make it applicable to all sectors irrespective of the size of the operation. Instead of saying Factory Act will not be applicable if you have only 10 workers, or you have PF will not be applicable if you have only 20 workers, I think those clauses need to be suitably amended. And it should be, all these acts should be also simplified to ensure greater compliance by the industry. And in turn, government should shun frequent wage hikes. This tendency, these are political, to get political brownie points. They should try and not indulge in frequent wage hikes so that the competitive global competitiveness is preserved. The second is now the question of absorption of additional costs across the value chain. Because if you start paying, if the sector start paying the minimum wages and start looking after social security, safety, working condition, training, probably we have done some rough calculations across the value chain up to the garmenting stage, there could be 6 to 7% increase in the cost. Now, how can that be absorbed? So we have suggestions to make. 1/3 of it can be easily be passed on to the customer. Partly because with better technology, as I explained to you as we go forward, premium and better quality and services, customer will be willing to pay. Now, rest of the cost should be shared between government and the manufacturer. Now, government contribution could be, and it has been also articulated by other panelists, lowering of the interest rate on borrowings. Of course, they're giving capital subsidies, which can be improved further. Concessional power supply, which some states are giving, like Maharashtra is supplying to power loom sector at 3 rupees a unit. Subsidized training and healthcare facilities. We have a full-fledged skills development ministry who's partly taking care of it, but I think the need is much higher, and they have to involve the informal sector as well. And all these facilities should be given subject to all the compliances, so that people, industry is nudged to pay minimum wages. Then there has to be some corrected of inverted GST structure. In textile value chain, we have duty structure ranging from 18% for fiber goes up to 5% to 12%. I think this structure government is working on. If this is made uniform across the value chain, I think there will be some benefit to the even to the unorganized sector in terms of full input tax credit. Then, for export purposes, the scheme which is applicable to only garmenting or made up should also be, whatever incentive scheme is there, that is emission of local taxes, etc., should also be extended to other sectors. And government should try and also resolve this issue, try and work out suitable FTA with Europe, which is number 2 market for all our textile products. Similarly, as already pointed out, development of integrated clusters for minimizing logistics and waste management costs. This has been experienced in many clusters. They integrated right from spinning to the garment making. I think then there could be lot of saving in terms of lower cost of logistics, wastewater management, and also skill development. And the last is, which government can do, is this curbing of duty-free imports from neighboring countries like Bangladesh and dumping of goods by China, which is impacting our Make in India initiative. Now, what manufacturer in turn should do is to stop over-relying on historical wage arbitrage. They probably feel that if we pay lower wages, we can be competitive and we can circumvent all other issues. They must begin right-sizing the units to minimize manpower per meter. Normally in these small manufacturing units, the manpower cost per machine or per meter is much higher because of the lower scale of economies. So once they start right-sizing their units, they will become more competitive. And then they must, now with all these incentives and support from the government, they should begin overall upgradation of machines, improve productivity, and also rejection rates, which we have been experienced because we've been also dealing with a lot of vendors who are in the sector. I think this collective approach can produce desired results. Raw material I'm not touching because I don't see this as a cost saver, because raw material prices have to be, the difference has to be passed on to the B2B buyer. And normally the landed cost, normally the domestic supplier try to match the landed price. So they maintain the price parity, but I don't see any saving happening. As such, cotton textile, we are worldwide. In cotton, we are worldwide competitive. Cotton and flax natural fibers free of duty, import is allowed. And exports of any item, the import duty, you can get a refund or you get a drawback. So it hardly is relevant there. So there are, of course, some incidents of custom tariff on man-made fiber, 5% fiber, 10% of filament yarn. I think this is in almost all the countries, and domestic markets normally absorb these tariffs. But of course, there is always scope to reduce it. But even if you reduce it, the benefit will not go to the manufacturer. Benefit goes to the buyer, to the brands. So I think what is required at this moment is the collective conscience of the stakeholder and the political will to implement it. So it's the enforcement which has to be taken care of. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. May I now request Professor Nagaraj?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Professor Nagaraj, same 5 to 7 minutes, please. And it would be useful if you wanted to react to some of the points made by other panelists.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir, we can hear you. We can hear you, Professor.
We can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I would make two broad points. One is the cost of production, other is on the labor side. The cost of production, what Mr. Amit Kapoor said, I think has a point. Our costs are on the high side. And see, one thing which was brought to my notice, in fact, we did a large study of MSMEs about 1.5 years ago, and I visited a couple of textile centers, especially Tirupur. One thing which a lot of people told me was that yes, on cotton we have our prices, input costs are not high, but on the man-made fiber, that is the fiber and the yarn, I think our costs are high. In fact, today in the garment segment, it is very rarely it is purely cotton or purely synthetic. In fact, if you take any garment these days, it's a mixture of variety of fabrics. And I was told by a number of people in many clusters that our costs of man-made fiber is high because imports from China are restricted and there is a domestic monopoly. And that seems to be this. I mean, if you ask me for numbers, I don't have with me, but this is something which a number of people said. I don't know whether you came across this in your study. If it is so, I think it's worth looking into it more detail. On the labor side, I think the report as it is written has a lot on the labor side. And I wonder why I wonder why the report could not look into the non-compliance of Social Security legislation. Because if you recall, this current government since 2015 has been saying that their main concern is to formalize the workers, right? Which means they are brought under the network of ESI and EPF. And these clusters are eminently suitable for formalization of workers wherever the workers are more than 10 or 20, depending upon the rules. Okay. So it would have been nice if this study looked at what percentage of workers are formalized or what got formalized during last 3-4 years. It would have been a good way to check the ground reality about the formalization. Okay. So I think that we would be doing a good service to to verify the the contentions made in policy making circles. Okay, that's first point. Two, see, wages will not rise unless there is increase in labor demand. That's basic economic. So we have not enough labor demand. That's why the wages are so low. How to increase wages is the industry has to expand. Exports have to grow, but we know that we just been left out in the entire textiles game. Mr. Amit mentioned about few numbers. This correct. Question is, we just simply don't have the scales. And if you have to have scales, we need to have large investments in these clusters. Like, in fact, when we were doing study in Tirupur, the biggest merchant, who's a biggest buying agent, told us that in 2005, when MFA was abolished, China was prepared to flood the world with cheap textiles, and they had created three times the capacity they were actually using, because they knew the market. They knew that. So the point is, they had planned for that kind of expansion. Okay, but now we see in India there is no such long-term thinking at all. Okay, now see, last 6 months we have been talking about COVID affecting China, and here is an opportunity for India. In fact, many honorable ministers have been saying, hey, here is an opportunity. But what are we doing to capitalize on that? There is practically no realistic strategic thinking on that. And all of them require large-scale investments in brick and mortar and machinery, which I find there's not enough thinking about it. I wish the report highlights some of this, because unless we have large-scale investments in upgrading some of these clusters, we will simply not get the scales required to make a dent in the international market. Right? Right. Lastly, skill development. I think my view is skill development problem is overdone in a lot of these issues, particularly in textiles, except for in garments where you have garment cutting. Okay, when designing, they require a little high-end skills, but bulk of the work is very low in order. Workers join as helpers and learn the required skills. So therefore, it is, I think, skill issue in this industry at this stage of development for bulk of the manufacturing, it is not an issue. So I think we need to concentrate more on getting the scales right. Okay, getting our man-made fiber pricing right. Okay, I think, and for workers, getting them social security, which the government has been promising, asking them to make them formal. I think which one would like to know what's happening at the ground level, and at least they flag the issue with the concerned people at the policy level. These are the things which I suppose the report can effectively do. I'll stop here. I'll come back later if there is anything. Thank you. Hello.
So Professor Nagaraj, are you through?
Yes, I said I'm through. Yeah, yes. Is it?
Pradeep, we can hear him. He's saying he's through. He's waiting for you to continue. I think we lost Pradeep.
Yeah, Samar is there.
Okay.
Professor Nagaraj, you're through, right?
Yes, he said he's through.
Fine. No, I'm now inviting the next panelist. The final panelist is Samar Verma of Ford Foundation. And please, Samar.
Thank you, Pradeep. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Go ahead.
Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to, if I may say, come back to discussions on textiles after a long gap of almost 1.5 decades. I really enjoyed every bit of the conversation. I must congratulate CUTS and the project advisory team led by Mr. Myra for, I think, what has come out to be an excellent report. We were particularly keen, I know from my colleagues who were in charge of this project before I joined. I joined Ford Foundation only a few months ago. My colleagues did tell me that some of the, if I may say, principles that were laid out by Mr. Myra about on what is it that we were looking for. We were not looking for a national report based on macroeconomic data and unemployment and CSS, NSS data. What we were looking for were stories on what's happening on the ground, because over a period of time, there's a strong feeling that there's a lot of disconnect between what seems to be happening in policy community and what seems to be the reality on the ground. And that disconnect seems to be growing, particularly because when we work with our partners, we begin to see that disconnect is real and is growing. The other thing which particularly is also important, and I know that I'm repeating what Mr. Myra said, but it's worth repeating because this entire concept of GDP as the new God in whatever model that we call today. Even the father of GDP, as some of you would know, was not in favor of. In fact, he denounced GDP as a measure of well-being. And I think over a period of time, what's happening is, 0.1% up or down in GDP is seeming to define our lives and define so much of public policy space and discussions, a lot of which does not seem to be very meaningful. So I'm particularly happy and grateful to CUTS and to the Project Advisory Committee for having kept these principles in mind as they have gone about preparing this report. I also know that there have been wonderful conversations and some of the excellent suggestions that came from panelists who spoke before me on ways in which the report can be tightened. And I'm sure that CUTS is taking note of some of those things. We look forward to the final version of the report. I'll just say two things, in terms of, here I'm not wearing the hat of a Ford Foundation program officer. I'm very tempted to, let's say, wear the hat of somebody who's worked in textile industry and has done some work in that industry. Research. There are two things that I wanted to say. One is, I wanted to bring attention to the Rana Plaza tragedy that happened in Bangladesh that some of you might be aware of. In April 2013, just about 7 years ago, there was a Rana Plaza building in Dhaka which collapsed. It had 5 garment factories, 1,130 lives were lost, thousands of people, mostly women, were injured. This was the largest industrial disaster in Bangladesh. What were the chief causes? According to several studies, including by think tanks that we were supporting when I was, excuse me, with IDRC until a few months ago, there were 3 principal causes. One was very fundamental, and there were 2 proximate causes. The 2 proximate causes were, one was the weak government regulation in regard to safety standards and working conditions. Second was just the industry's attitude towards workers, looking at workers as cogs in the wheel, and that came out in several panelists' conversations earlier. But the fundamental thing which came out as the principal cause was what has been called a savage capitalism or sweatshop business model of global supply chain, which basically leads to what is, has been called as race to the bottom. And I know I'm using a lot of acronyms here, a lot of terms, but I'm just wanting to make sure that I don't take too much time. It's not without reason that a $5 shirt manufactured in Dhaka is selling at $25 in Walmart stores. Until that fundamental reality changes, we are continuing to grapple with the sweatshop conditions that exist in. What happened as a result of the Rana Plaza tragedy was also something very important and useful. And again, it speaks to some of the things that perhaps we might learn a lesson or two from. So 14 different stakeholders from a variety of labor movements, women's rights movements, manufacturing companies, government, international buying houses, etc., think tanks, they all came together to monitor the commitments that the governments and industrial manufacturers made to improve the working conditions and labor rights in Bangladesh. That led to a considerable improvement in the issues around labor health and safety and working conditions. But then it hit a red roadblock. And let me just kind of, point to that roadblock by way of some of the numbers that came out of another study that was conducted by University of Pennsylvania. So between 2013, when the Rana Plaza incident happened, and 2018, when the study was conducted, the unit price of garments paid by international buyers to Bangladeshi manufacturers declined by 13%. The profit margins of exporters declined by 13%. Volume of exports, on the other hand, went up by 10%, as well as the lead time for delivery went down by 8%. Now, what is called as iron triangle of sourcing, which is basically the lowest possible price, highest possible quality, fastest possible delivery lead times, has been principally responsible for the way in which resources have been redirected away from protection of workers and improvement of working conditions. But is it all bad news? I'm afraid not. And I wanted to particularly congratulate Sabina for having brought this to our attention. And I'll just give another set of data to endorse what she said in terms of it's not always race to the bottom that leads to higher profit margins and increased exports. There was a study conducted in 2018 by two profs, one from MIT, other from Brown University. The study is published in American Journal of Political Science. They surveyed over 2,000 exporting firms in 36 emerging countries. And what they found is that the annual sales of those firms that actually complied with higher social, labor, and environmental standards actually increased by 4% per year compared to those that did not. And this was particularly true in the apparel sector. So in other words, it's time, and perhaps COVID today, enables that opportunity where underlying systems and mindsets, which is always racing to the bottom and looking at cost of production and looking at how to reduce the cost of production in order to improve the competitiveness, that mindset needs to change. It's not always race to the bottom that leads to improved profits and improved sales. Perhaps it's time to bring about a change. And so this is, and to me, as I said, it's a disaster like COVID which provides us that opportunity to actually see the fragility of the economic systems that have always been there, but perhaps not been visible when the tides are all rising. So let me stop here. Again, congratulations, Cuts, and thank you very much for all the hard work to the project advisory team and to the panelists for bringing in excellent viewpoints. And of course, I'm personally delighted to be their homecoming to textiles. Thanks very much, Pradeep and Bipul.
Thank you very much, Samar. I just wanted to tell Samar, who's joined Ford Foundation very new. Of course, Samar is an old friend, and talking about textiles and clothing, he had done a study for us many years ago on the agreement of textiles and clothing in the WTO, if you remember, Samar. Anyway, just to tell you, Samar, that our relationship with Ford Foundation is as old as we are, which is about 35 years old. So just to give you the kind of depth of our relationship. Professor Nagar, just one point I wanted to respond to is the issue on which we are working otherwise also. On PTF, which is a major input for polyester-based fabrics, so far you were right. There's this simple oligopoly of, or rather dominance of Reliance. They were using anti-dumping very cleverly to see to it that imported prices, in spite of a lower duty, would still be more expensive than what they sold it at. There were just 3 or 4 manufacturers, and Reliance was the highest. That anti-dumping action has now been stopped. And so we expect that polyester fiber fabrics mix would start. I mean, I remember the the history of this is that the All India Cotton Textiles Association had even put out a threat to boycott any kind of polyester fiber. But this is just to put in context. I think the larger issue here that we seem to be discussing is this study is not about textiles and clothing. I just wanted to remind everybody again that this study is about workers' welfare in the context of 3 or 4 or 5 labor-intensive sectors that we're doing the study in. And the first sector that we chose was textile and clothing. The next sector, which is already ongoing, is on food processing and so on, construction, tourism, etc., etc. What has come out very clearly from all this is, and including which sort of relates to another discussion we are having on planning, again, under Arun's leadership, planning for the 21st century is, the fact is for the next 24 months, we see still a very topsy-turvy economic world, whether it's globally or, or nationally or even regionally. And this gives us the right opportunity to be able to impress upon the policymakers that it's time to think in terms of long-term strategic thinking, as Professor Nagaraj said, or even what other speakers were speaking about. So these are a few important issues that I pick up. Of course, there were many other important issues, including, as Sabina pointed out, in the context of competitiveness versus workers' wages and so on. Now, let me open the floor and invite, as the first intervener, Abhishek Kumar, who used to be the project manager for this until recently, and I had said earlier, who had anchored the project pretty well. Abhishek.
Thank you. Thank you, Pradeep. Can everybody listen to me? Yeah?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. So I have just 3 or 4 very sharp interventions related to the points already spoken about. And I would like to start with the first point, which is the times that we are in and and how it relates to the project. The project really started in the larger context of addressing inequality. And what COVID has also shown us that pandemics, one part of the reason why pandemics all happen is virus. The other part is also inequality. I mean, if the world was far more equal, pandemics would not really happen. There are so many vulnerable people the spread of pandemic is very, very easy. But there are a couple of points that I want to basically pick up right now. Sabina spoke about broader guiding framework. I think the biggest value for me this project has given us is a step towards that bigger, broader framework and how to address that. Let me give you an example. When we started studying the supply side factors, one of the thought that I came back particularly, and I discussed it with my colleagues, is that of all the factors of production that we have, there is only one factor of production that is administered, which is the capital through interest rates and cost of capital. And the other factors of production, we have no idea about their actual costs. And I personally feel, and there are economists sitting over here who can better guide us, and this also relates to the systems thinking that Mr. Myra was talking about, that for so long, we are only administering one factor of production and have no clue about the actual cost of other factors of production, because the demand and supply chain is completely broken or distorted. It is natural that even that factor of production is only a guesswork. The cost of that factor of production, that is capital, would only be guesswork, and probably the distortions will carry along the chain. So that is number one point. So I think this project has also given us an insight into the fact that we need to also understand how demand and supply can be better matched with other factors of production to be able to reduce overall supply side factor costs. The second thing which I wanted to sort of pick up is what Amit had spoken about, export-led growth. It looks like the export-led growth is not going to be there for some time, but it has to be balanced. Why I'm saying it's because export-led growth can very easily take the focus away from the consumption story that we have in India, because of which we're talking about what we're talking about. So I would stress that it's not just the export, but also look at the import story as well. To give you an example, and Mr. Mehta also spoke about it, when we studied the supply side factors, we realized that if we didn't have the duty structure, the kind of duty structure that we have, we could actually save a lot of money per cluster per day, and that could determine a huge difference in the survival of an enterprise or even well-being of an enterprise, which through a proper compact could be reflected into well-being of a worker. So the third point also is related to electricity. The problem that exists today is that we are looking at everything in silos. If you go to a textile minister and talk about textile ministry or regional and state level interventions also, each sector is approaching with their problems, and the ministries are hardly able to relate that problem. Now, electricity is an input for all the sectors. So if I'm setting a certain tariff for, say, textile industry, I better know how it's going to affect some other sector. So that kind of systems approach and integrated approach is something that's completely missing. And in that context, what we found is that the textile commissionerate can play a huge role, but unfortunately, it's a body which is absolutely insipid and unable to sort of make a move in any direction. You just have to go to the textile commission in Bombay to realize that there is nothing that happens over there. So I think I'll limit my interventions just with these points. Thank you, Pradeep.
Thank you, Abhishek. That was excellent. And any other person from the audience who would like to ask a question or make a point? Please raise your hand. There is a symbol at the... Yeah, who's that? Please identify yourself.
SK Gupta, panel. You want to... okay. See, my fellow panelist was talking about the power, the electricity charges. I think center has not been able to do anything about it because it has always been a state subject. So by and large, all states are giving some construction subsidies to the textile sector. Of course, varies. Maharashtra is the highest, then you have Andhra giving, Karnataka giving. Most of the states are giving, and especially to the SME sector, which is quite competitive globally. But still more to be done. If it can be centrally administered, of course, there are others who will start demanding. There's a challenge. Second is, as rightly pointed out earlier, that it's not the cost of the fiber which is the material now, because internet available at the international price. I'm talking man-made fiber. What we lack in India is the scale of manufacturing fabric, which is not available to Tirupur and all. You know, we have to have large-scale enterprises dyeing, continuous dyeing, and we can produce color continuity can be maintained so that they can then service the large orders like we are able to do in cotton. I think that is where government, even textile ministry has been trying to give. They have in fact started as a special mission to provide some extra support. I think their industry has to take initiative, especially the players like Reliance, which are now, they can always be vertically integrated to take this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. And since we've got only about 7 minutes left for this meeting to conclude, is there anybody else wanted to ask? Arnab?
Yes, I want to just raise the point. Yeah, actually,
go ahead.
Yeah. So actually, when we were doing a study under the border huts, what we found is there are many clusters in the distant geographical locations along the India-Bangladesh border, and their women folks, they are into a lot of manufacturing handloom items, and somehow their product fail to reach the market. So what I feel is, in this COVID pandemic, we should also be looking at making looking at solutions, more localized solutions, rather I would say, to open up these cross-border trading relations, which can then again help in expanding the long-term value chains actions.
Good point. Good point. Arun, may I request you to please respond?
Yes, thank you.
Arun?
Thank you, Pradeep. I hear three very strong messages through all the very sharp and very informed comments of the 8 persons who have spoken. The first is a point that Sabina has made strongly and others have endorsed, that we have to focus on human beings in enterprises. Okay, so it's an attitudinal thing, as she says. The human being is not there just as a pair of hands. As a reminder, Henry Ford, who said, I just needed a pair of hands, why did we get a whole human being? So that attitude towards the human being who's in the enterprise has to change. And from that springs then how that person is used as an asset in the enterprise rather than as a cost. And in fact, the whole purpose of development of GDP is to improve the incomes and well-beings of human beings. So it starts there about our fundamental attitude towards human beings in an economy. And economists, I think, seem to treat human beings as numbers, as human beings are just inputs for the sake of growing GDP. We wish they weren't human beings because they're a nuisance in the political process and we could improve the GDP very well. The second point, therefore, comes to political economy, which has been brought about already, as Professor Nagraj said, in the matter of man-made fibers, with some information, and that's been supported again, is that in the shaping of policies, we must hear the voices of the people for whom the policies are being made ultimately. And they are not on the table. The result is, like in that matter of the fibers as has been pointed out, if the fiber was available more inexpensively here by reducing the import duties, who would benefit? A lot of workers, a lot of enterprises would benefit. Who would lose is the profits of some small people. So there's a political economy question here also in the framing of the purposes of our various reforms. The third one is a point, really a bigger point was coming out, which is to do with economists and our academics ourselves generally, is I think we have been stuck too long on the idea of economies of scale. That if you do some things on a larger scale, then you're competitive. What this global pandemic has shown, and before that actually, that countries were closing in. Boundaries were coming for other reasons before pandemic. They were coming for other geopolitical reasons. And so we had to be localizing our complete chains within ourselves to create economies of scope. If you have a greater variety of inputs and outputs for a process together, that becomes more viable and more resilient. And in the cluster study, you also pointed this out, that it was those clusters which were more complete were always more competitive and more resilient than those in which they were scattered. I mean, you had people producing one input only for the value chain in one place and people producing another input for the value chain in another place. And in a global system where the boundaries are coming up, you cannot be moving across. You cannot be moving across boundaries, political boundaries, geographical boundaries. And today, with the COVID, we are getting smaller and smaller, and I'm not unhappy about it. And to the point that Amit made very well, that we have an opportunity today with technology to make many small enterprises together as a larger network. And those networks need not be global networks. They could be very strong networks in large parts of our country. Our country is pretty large. And linking them to Abhishek's point, but there's a domestic demand also which you can gear up. How does domestic demand get geared up? If people earn wages. So it's one thing. If the wages don't go up, demand will not go up, right? And if the demand doesn't go up, investment will not come. So this study is focusing us on that question. What is happening on the ground with people who are earning small incomes through being owners of enterprises or earning small incomes as workers? Look at the system from that very small micro lens and then work around and see how we can make it healthy. So people are at the center. The political economy must be managed better than we managed it so far, for which I think the voices of people in enterprises and in the reform and policy process must be strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you very much. And that also reminds me of a very important point made by Abhishek, was on the issue about equality or inequality, which reflects in one manner or the other as to what was mentioned very correctly by Sabina, was that, are we valuing humans as human beings? And that is something which will then perhaps lead us to a great moral rearmament movement. I mean, let us be, in as much as we respect these values as they're very important, the fact is that what is it that can happen on the ground is again very important. And there, Arun, your point about political economy is something which we'll have to grapple with. In these times to come, it will become more and more difficult as we progress. As it is, there's a lot of halagulla happening in terms of whether the units will be able to restart, where is the labor. Labor has gone back to their home states. Will they be able to come back? I mean, it's in quite a mess actually. If you notice, in the next 6 months, I see a lot of this mess still trying to sort itself out, and then finally things happening in the. So we had an excellent discussion so far, and we have taken on board the comments made by various panelists as well as, unless a panelist has a last minute point, I would hand over to Sarthak, who is leading the research of this particular project, to conclude. Is there any other last minute comment by any panelist?
Pradeep, I just wanted to say thank you for a really interesting report. And I didn't say this before, but congratulations to you and your team for also sparking a very interesting discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarthak, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I hope it was a mutually enriching session for all of us. I'll just summarize the key points that were addressed and be highlighted by the esteemed members of our panel. So firstly, Mr. Arun Maira, he identified the need for a fresh lens to see the problem, and not only see the problem as a measure of GDP, which measures the economy's size, but also well-being, which measures its health. And ultimately the need for hearing of voices as the key to design a policy which is sensitive to the people and the problem. Then Mr. Amit Kapoor added to it and highlighted the stats on the various costs, especially the financial costs, and the role of the global value chains and the globalization phenomena that's happening here. Also, he highlighted the need for the problem of regulatory capture in this sector, which is what we are seeing on the ground as well. Then Ms. Diwan highlighted the kind of work Just Jobs Network does, especially the comparative research in this sector on business competitiveness. She cited the Vietnam example where economic upgrading goes hand in hand with labor welfare, and that is something which we can learn upon and include in the sectors to follow in this study. Ms. Rituparna highlighted a rather naive approach to this entire discussion, where the jobs aspect or the future of work post the COVID and the role of discretionary spending and how this will affect the entire way our economic sectors work, that was highlighted there. Mr. S.K. Gupta highlighted the much needed industry point of view, where he highlighted that enterprise level issues should be abolished, Minimum Wages Act should be applicable, and such framework should be applicable to all sizes of enterprises and not just a few. And then he concluded by saying that collective consciousness of stakeholders and political will should be the way forward from here. Professor Nagraj highlighted the role of investments in this sector and the need for a long-term planned expansion, and also specific issues relating to social security provisions and how we should look at skill development. Finally, Mr. Samar Verma reiterated the point that Mr. Maira put out in the first remarks, that there is a need for a new lens. Then he wore his textile expert hat to get us through how resource utilization for better working conditions and should be there, and how it's not just a race to bottom or race to sales and profits, but a larger holistic comprehensive picture which is required here. There were some excellent interventions by Mr. Abhishek Kumar, Mr. Gupta and Arnab Ganguly, which were again winded up by Mr. Maira, where he highlighted the need for seeing human beings as an asset and not just a cost, and how economies of scale should translate into economies of scope in order to get a better future. I once again thank you all and will keep our network posted on other developments in this study.
Thank you very much to all, and wish you goodbye until we meet again or until we chat again.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. It was excellent. Thank you.